You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian. All right. Well, here we go. Another episode of Shockwave Skull Sessions. And, of course, we got the man himself, the Armenian maven of metal, Mr. Bob Nalbandian. What's up, Bob?
Good. I'll never live that title down, man. What's going on, Matt?
That's it. That's your name.
All right. Got a great episode, man. Got the StreamYard going again. So for those that have video, can check it out through StreamYard. Otherwise, of course, you could check it out via audio. But I do suggest the video because you can see all our pretty faces here. And we got a lot of pretty faces on this one, man. We got James Beach, extraordinary editor for the phone book, a brand new phone book. Look at this thing. Jesus Christ, man. How big? How do you make money off this thing? The printing costs alone must cost a fortune.
It's not cheap, unfortunately, but we kind of intended it to be a little smaller than that, but it's just the way it goes sometimes. So.
All right. Rusted Metal is the title of the brand new book, A Guide to Heavy Metal and Hard Rock Music in the Pacific Northwest from 1970 to 1995. I was a big fan of a lot of the Northwest metal bands, and along with James Beach, we got a couple guys from Sanctuary. We got the original guitar player, Lenny Rutledge. How you doing there, Lenny?
I'm good.
And we got brand new singer.
Yeah.
Well, I guess, are you brand new? I guess not fairly new.
Obviously, years.
For,
he's beyond rookie status now.
All right. All right. Cool. So we'll be talking everything to Northwest metal here. You know, from the early days, from the 80s and, you know, the pre-grunge era. There was a lot of stuff happening in the Northwest. But, James, why don't you start out and talk a little bit about the new book you have?
Well, so Rusted Metal's a book I started with a friend of mine, Brian Nairn, back in the summer of 2014. And we both, you know, I had the idea. I worked in writing and publishing and editing for a number of years now, and kind of started. We did horror fiction, was a magazine I did for about 10 years, and a book line, and worked for a couple other book publishers in that field. And I did a couple special issues on horror and rock, and I'd always liked. Growing up, I was always a fan of music, and especially gravitated towards hard rock and metal. You know, pretty young. And, you know, got into Kiss in the 70s, as a lot of kids did, and just kind of gravitated towards, you know, AC/DC and Van Halen. And then the new album came out, and I started buying a lot of those records of Maiden and Saxon. And, you know, we kind of had some bands coming out in Portland and Seattle that were pretty cool, that were really kind of taking some of those influences and doing their own thing. And so we'd hear Queensryche on the radio. I'd hear Wild Dogs or Rail, or a lot of these guys were getting airplay pretty heavy. And so, you know, I grew up with this music. I went to various shows over the years at the clubs, mainly in Portland, but I went to a few in Seattle too, and had family up there, and my parents are from there. So we went up there a lot, and I got to go to a lot of the record stores and some shows up there and things. And you know, it was one of those things, the grunge thing hit, you know, a lot of people were doing books on that stuff, and some of the bands that became famous. And I just kind of kept going, hey, nobody's doing anything on the metal scenes though. And we had so much, you know, we had so many good bands, and, you know, just a lot of bands and over the years, and a lot of them influenced other people. And so I kind of expected Jeff Gilbert, who was a big guy in the scene, and, you know, Lenny knows him quite a bit too, I know. And, you know, somebody like him, who's a writer or somebody, you know, in the scene, and just nobody ever did one. And so I just kind of figured, well, you know, I know enough about this stuff. I could probably put something together, and tapped my friend Brian, who I'd known I met him like at record collectors shows in around 1990. And we stayed friends over the years, and Brian's a huge archivist. He's seen tons of shows, and he collected all kinds of music related stuff, especially a lot of Northwest stuff. He was the one that turned me on to a lot of stuff he's a lifelong Tacoma guy. So he saw a lot of stuff up north there. And we just, it was something he was kind of thinking of too. And so we partnered up to work on it together. A couple other friends ended up coming into it that helped a lot along the way with doing interviews and writing parts and had a lot of archival material. And so it really came together. And a friend of ours, James Tolan, who went back into the scene being a manager for his friend's band Overlord and was kind of, friends with a lot of other guys and people in other bands. He still was pretty well liked and had a lot of connections with people. And so he opened up a lot of doors. And between us all, we kind of just went after everybody we kind of knew or knew of and tried to get a number of interviews that would, wasn't going to be one from every band kind of thing, but more notable people or people that had interesting stories or, especially people that were involved in the scene throughout the years and still are, were something we really wanted to kind of talk to those people and show, that scene was viable then and it still is now. And, probably more so than, it was even back then in some ways, but, so it just kind of came together. It took a long time for research, though. It took about 5 years to write the book and a lot of research, a lot of travel, interviewing. I tried to interview as many people as we could in person kind of thing. That's always a lot more fun and more interesting than somebody kind of typing their answers back. But we had some of that stuff too. And, so we interviewed people from a lot of the different bands in Portland and Seattle. So we covered pretty much tried to cover the whole Northwest, Oregon, Washington, even Idaho to a degree, had some metal bands, and like a lot of traveling bands kind of hit those areas, and also Vancouver, BC, just because that was over the border. So a lot of people came over our way or vice versa. And so there was definitely a lot of integration, and, Heart recorded up there and Queensryche and other bands over the years. So there's definitely connections with those. And, we just really, the book started out to be more of a narrative type of thing where it just kind of told the story. And as time went on, that didn't really work. So I turned it into a reference guide and just rewrote it and kind of did it in that way, because a lot of it was pretty repetitive. We were trying to tell a story where the bands were telling, members of the bands were telling the same story, and the information was telling the same story in bios and things. So it ended up just making more sense to do it as a reference guide that you could look through and see bands and read some interviews that kind of elaborated on a lot of the scene with it. And it just worked out much better that way. It still ended up being a huge thing, but it would have been a lot bigger if we did it the other way. But we traveled around, talked to a lot of people, and, we had almost 100 interviews. I think about 92, 93 interviews, something like that, with people from different bands all over the Northwest. And, some of it was sitting down with people at a restaurant. Some of it was like Metal Church. I interviewed Kurt and Mike Howe and Rick Van Zandt backstage before they played. Lenny we talked to, and Royal Dane out at Lenny's place. They invited us out for a barbecue and had a lot of fun doing that and doing the interview. And, it was really cool to hang with them and see the little home studio that they had there and talk about a lot of that. And yeah, we talked to so many different people. It was really cool. So it just kind of blossomed. And then it took about 1.5 years to edit the thing after that, because there was a lot of stuff to go through, and so many people kept popping up. So many people just like, oh yeah, my band was this. I'm like, oh, okay. So now we've got some people that were actually in the band. We made the decision to include lesser known bands. That maybe some of these were even just sort of pickup bands that played a battle of the bands or two or something. That sort of goof band or whatever with friends. But it seemed like there was a lot of relevance just because people went on to other bands and as I said, a lot of people.
A lot of history there, man. A lot of history. Yeah, starting from the 70s, obviously with Heart and a lot of other bands. But Matt, I'm curious, being from New York, what was your introduction? Was it like Queensryche? I mean, it was obviously pre-grunge. What was your introduction to like the Northwest?
Yeah, it was It was definitely Queensryche when that 4-song the EP came out, and a buddy of mine's brother, he had an older brother who had gotten in. And I was, I think, in 5th grade or something. I was really young. But I remember him saying, "Hey, man, we got to listen to this record. I'm really digging these guys." I'm like, "Who's this?" And he's like, "This band Queensryche." And so we played it. We heard that, and obviously, yeah, that was my introduction. Obviously, yeah. I mean, I think like most people across the country, at least at my age or a little older than me, it was definitely Queensryche, no doubt. Yeah. And what I was wondering, James, too, I guess Lenny, you could talk about this too.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say one of the things I did notice, because all the detail, the minutia in the book and everything. I mean, it seemed like musicians in the area too. They were always like in like 3 or 4 bands at a time, sort of thing, right? It was like because you definitely did a great job, you guys, connecting all the bands together with all the detail and the minutia that's in here and stuff. And I guess was that kind of what it was like, Lenny? Was it just everybody had like 2 or 3 bands going at once to try to, I guess? I mean, what was the, were the musicians, were you guys looking to really hone down and have one band, or was it sort of that you were just kind of looking around and whatever was going to stick, it stuck, or whatever picked up, through fans within the metal scene?
Yeah, I mean, I think we knew bands like that, but for the most part, I think the guys who were super focused were kind of focused on one particular band and just kind of giving it all for that. I mean, I know later on, a lot of the grunge guys kind of did a little bit more of that. It seemed like they shared a lot of that, a little bit more of like Pearl Jam and Temple of the Dog and stuff like that. I mean, that was very common. I don't know of it as much, in the metal scene. I mean, it probably happened. We were just kind of so focused in our own little world. I think we were part of the scene, but it seemed like we were kind of, we didn't become part of it until we started to become more known. We just kind of kept to ourselves and really hunkered down a lot. It rains a lot up here.
Hey, Lenny, I want to ask you, I think we met before with Sanctuary, a dinner party when you first signed with CBS. I think the debut record had just come out. And White Rabbit was getting a little bit of airplay, I think, on Candy C at the time. But Hannah Bolte from Epic Records, you remember Hannah, the publicist?
Yeah. Yes, I do.
To dinner at the Rainbow. I was working with Metal Rendezvous. She invited me, and we all hung out. So, I mean, this had to be, 80. What did that record come out? 87,
it would be
88?
like 87, probably, yeah.
Yeah, we went out to the Rainbow. And I remember your drummer was underage. And he got in trouble for drinking. He didn't. I'm never cool at the Rainbow. They said, "Hey, you're not supposed to drink, but it's okay. You were that."
Yeah, that's probably right. Yeah, that would be right. Yeah, wow. Yeah,
remember here.
I do remember going out to dinner. I don't remember the details. It was quite a long time ago. But I do remember she took us out, at least once. So yeah.
Well, those were the good days when the labels they did that. And Hannah was the greatest. She invited me to. Epic had a lot of the metal bands at that time.
Well, and there was so much money that it was all about that. It was great. They
exactly. We'd go out. They'd take the press out to dinner with the bands, and they actually had budgets to do that. But that was funny. But Sanctuary. I was a big fan of that, and I think my introduction was kind of funny. Being in LA or Orange County, LA area, I remember the first Metal Massacre came out. And that had Malice, and I love those 2 Malice tracks, Captain of Light and Kick You Down. And obviously they moved to LA in the mid 80s or early 80s, but they originated out of I believe the Seattle.
They're Portland guys.
I thought they were Portland guys.
Yeah, Matt McCourt's still arguing with me about that one. He thinks that they're an LA band, but. They recorded demos. Yeah, there was an interesting thing around them. Black and Blue and Wild Dogs were sort of like they were all friends. Jeff, the guitarist, Jeff Horton, that went by Jeff Mark, that was the Wild Dogs guitarist. He worked as like an intern for one of the bigger recording studios in Portland, Recording Associates, and he got some recording time. And so the Wild Dogs thing was kind of just a project. And I guess on the original Malice demos, Dean Castronovo and Matt play bass and drums on that. And so it was just James Neal and Jay Reynolds and those 2 guys from Wild Dogs. And so they all sort of had this thing, and Jamie St. James and Pete Holmes both played on a couple different sets of Wild Dogs demos. So there was sort of that incestuous thing with them too, and just as things were sort of happening, the story I talked to both Mark Bain from Malice and Pete Holmes from Black and Blue, and their stories kind of mirror Black and Blue being the one that went and moved down there first. But Pete said that when they were Movie Star, which had Julian Raymond on vocals, and they were kind of a hard rock, sort of heavier Cars kind of thing at the time, from what I understand from people. I was too young, I never saw them, but they played a lot of clubs, and they were really popular and bigger venues, and played up in Seattle with different people. And Julian decided to quit, and Jamie wanted to step in on the vocals, and so they hired Pete on drums.
Right?
Yeah, he played drums before that, and he played drums in Jet, which was kind of a Kiss sort of wannabe band. They did some Kiss covers and some kind of Sweet and different things, and they kind of evolved into Movie Star as the years went on, and when they got Pete on drums, he was just such a heavy drummer that they just naturally became heavier. And that was what they liked anyway, with a lot of the stuff that was coming out of England and the LA scene. And Pete said that they had a guy, Andy Gilbert, that was he booked a lot of the hard rock bands from the 70s and pop bands and different stuff. And Pete said he just hated him. He said, you're too heavy. He didn't like him at all. And so he put him on like crappy Monday nights or whatever. And so they were getting like kind of screwed in Portland, but they were playing the Troubadour and the Rainbow and everything down in LA. And he said after a year of going down there and playing a bunch of nights, month after month, they just moved down there. And there was, obviously there wasn't record labels in Portland, of any major labels, wasn't much in Seattle. The 70s, there was a couple hubs up there. That's kind of how like Stryker, which had Scott Rosberg and Rick Randall, that kind of went back in the California music scene. Their band got signed to Arista. TKO got signed. Heart got signed. So there was some different major labels up there, but that all died as it went into the 80s. The laws kind of changed, and record companies really cut back on stuff. And
it's interesting because the independent labels. Sorry to cut you off there, but I was going to say. Particularly Metal Blade and Shrapnel is where, Shrapnel had Wild Dogs. I remember the Tonight Show off either the US Metal 2, I think that was on, and they had such a great song. I remember seeing them, I think before Black and Blue moved to LA, they did a show at the Country Club with Wild Dogs. The Country Club was
they played down in California. Matt says a lot of people still think that they were a San Francisco band. They played down there quite a bit.
I always thought they did a lot of San Francisco. They were but I knew of Black and Blue earlier through KJ Doughton. We were tape traders, and I do remember TKO. Were they on Atlantic? Because they weren't a major, and then they went to Combat. And I remember on Infinity. Combat.
They were an offshoot of MCA that a guy, Ron Alexenberg, headed up the label. I guess he was a big A&R guy. Yeah, they did the first record on that, and then they had a second record in the can, or starting to go in there kind of thing. It wasn't quite done. There's some multi-tracking on the stuff. In fact, it's actually it's this record that we put out a couple years back on a little label that I do with Brian, called Northwest Metalworks. This was supposed to be their second album in '79. It probably would come out like early '80s.
Look at that.
And,
prepared.
Yeah, so they kind of swapped out the first drummer and bass player with some friends from Yakima. It was a heavier drummer named Bill Durham, who was very John Bonham influenced, double bass drum stuff he had and all that. And Evan Sheely from Q5 and also TKO on bass. Right. And so they had a really heavy rhythm section. And then this stuff, it's not quite metal. It's not as, sort of Van Halen influence kind of metal that the In Your Face record was, but it definitely would have been very heavy for late '79, early '80 when the record might have come out. But the label folded, it's a really funny story that Brad Sinsel tells in the book, The Singer, about the guy that was the label head, Ron Alexenberg. He signed the Pope to a record, and this record exists. It's out there. There's not
the actual Pope.
The actual Pope John Paul II. So they did a record. Wow. They paid him something like $6 million non-recoupable, not in advance, like a license fee kind of thing. So you couldn't make, any of it back kind of thing. Right. And it was half either, I can't remember if it was a double record. Friend of mine actually has it, or if it was one side was speeches and one side was like the Pope doing folk songs. But it just tanked. It tanked, and by then he cost the record label so much, like the parent company MCA, so much money that they shut it down. And some bands like New England was on the label. They got signed, a couple other bands, but not TKO. They're like, no, we don't want.
Well, they got back on Combat, and they put that. And did they get a little bit heavier then? Because they were. That's when I kind of got into that. So and then I know Brad later joined War Babies. He kind of got into that whole grunge movement a little bit later, kind of Alice in Chains. I think they were a little bit too late on that.
They were, they were history. They were a little more. War Babies was the guitarist from Slaughterhouse 5 that were actually going to do a record and put out their stuff with Brad, and it was sort of a come lately band. He basically, TKO broke up in late '86, and he did like a project with Rick Pierce that was one of the original TKO guitarists, and he was just kind of floundering around thinking he basically was going to retire from music, and the War Babies thing happened, and he got into that, and then all of a sudden they got signed on. Yeah, Nick Terzo, that was the guy, I think the same guy that signed Alice in Chains, signed them, and they worked with. But yeah, that TKO is a really interesting story of bad luck, maybe a lot of it their own, and they'll fully admit that, but just kind of, that you get on a major label. At least they were touring with their first tour was like 30 dates, I think, with the Kinks as kind of their training ground. Then they played like 20 something dates opening for Cheap Trick after they'd come back from the Budokan tour thing. And then they played even like a handful of dates with like Angel and a few other bands, and came back and were working on the stuff. And they went over and did like they did the Texas Jam, and they did Mississippi River Jam with UFO and AC/DC and Van Halen and all these guys, and came back and recorded some stuff. Went out to the Japan Jam with Hart and the Beach Boys, and came back in the record. So
we're talking late '70s here, right?
Yeah, this was '79.
Yeah. Okay. Did they do the Texas Jam with Aerosmith? Was that the one, Aerosmith, the new Jam?
Was it Aerosmith with him? I think so. Yeah, I think like Nugent, Aerosmith, and Hart, and a few people.
It was kind of like the same as the Cal Jam, but kind of same lineup.
Yeah, that one was huge. That was like 60, 70,000 people or something.
I got the video of the old VHS video of Aerosmith.
Oh, wow.
They show all the different bands, but Sanctuary guys, man, what's your so how did the band Sanctuary form? I know now was Worrell, was he in a band before Sanctuary, or how did everything kind of come together there?
Yeah, Worrell was in Serpent's Night.
That's right.
At the time when we found him, Sanctuary was kind of.
You guys stole him, right?
It's weird because sometimes I tell that story and people hate me for it, but then it's like I don't know a band who hasn't done that. Sure. I mean, that seems like that's all we, that's how we get or people move up into, different ranks or whatever. Mm-hmm. But, we started Sanctuary out for, I think we were a band for about a year or so, maybe more. And we were trying out a bunch of people. It was my cousin and I. And literally when we were, we were still youngins, and we were talking about fact that we, someday we were going to start a band called Sanctuary. I don't know how we managed to pull all that together, but I mean, we thought about it years before we actually did it. And, once we finally got it all together, we were always searching for the right people, and eventually we got Dave Budbill, and he knew Worrell. He's like, I know this guy. He's kind of a weird dude, and he sings really cool, and he's in a band called Serpent's Night. He's like, I'll call him and see if they're interested, because the thing about us is we had this we had this huge stage setup. It was absolutely ridiculous, but you could never move this thing. And we had this massive warehouse. And when you walked in there, it was hard to not be impressed. You just right away, Dave was blown away by it. He's like, man, I'm going to tell Worrell about all this. And, we'll get him to see if we can get him to come down. And it was the same thing. But by the time Worrell had come down, we had actually upgraded to this warehouse that was so huge. You could park like 4 semis in this thing. It was gigantic, right? And so we had the stage in it, and it actually had like this like area up above where it was kind of like a catwalk, and people could look down on us while we were playing and everything. And this is where we rehearsed every day. And we were lucky enough to have there was a sound company in there too. So we had all their PA gear as well. So when Worrell came down to check it out, I mean, the look on his face was, holy shit, what's going on here? I mean, you guys are, what are you doing? I mean, it was like a stage that some big band would have, Of course, remember, we could never move this thing. So we never actually got to use it anywhere. It was just kind of a ridiculous thing that we built, but it looked really impressive. But when he came down, we had a bunch of songs already written, and he really liked the stuff, and we gave him a couple of songs, and literally the next week he came back with a handful of songs already written. So we kind of took off from there.
Very cool.
What an underrated vocalist he was, man.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Totally.
He should have been right up there with the Jeff Tates and all that. Just an amazing voice.
Yeah.
I saw. So I was like 17, maybe, I think, when I first saw you guys in Portland opening for Megadeth. In '87, I don't even think the record was out yet. I didn't know who you guys were, but
were we opening for Megadeth?
Yeah, Pine Street, I think it was, and
yeah, that's right.
I was just blown away. I was like, oh my god, these guys are amazing. They're like, Queensryche meets Metallica or Megadeth or something. It's just, like you had enough thrash element. I was big into that by then. I kind of went through, finding out about Metallica and Slayer and, 84 kind of range, Metal Church and all that. And so I came to see Megadeth, and I'm like, oh my God, these guys are, and so I got to see you guys a couple times, but I just remember being blown away. I'm like, these guys are from Seattle? What?
It was a really fun show. We did like a handful of dates with Megadeth before we really did anything, I remember we were terrified just because, we were one of those bands that didn't play around a lot in Seattle. So, at the point where we started to get some traction, we'd actually never done anything live. We weren't a live band. We were just a band that we practiced a lot. But, once we finally got out there, luckily we pulled it off. You know what I mean? It worked out for us because it wasn't like we were a seasoned band or anything. You know what I mean? We've been in our basements and studio, for years, but that was it. But yeah, that was a great, fun show.
That's the Queensryche model.
I was going to say, Dave Mustaine?
Yeah.
Dave Mustaine produced that first album, right?
Yeah. Again, that's a really interesting story because, and a lot of people think that, there's no way that you actually did this, but I'm not kidding. There was a point where, we had gotten as far as we could go. And I think we didn't want to become one of those bands that just played the clubs a lot, because we knew a lot of those bands around Seattle, and they would get sort of stuck in that club environment, and you would just never get out of that. And we wanted to try a different route. And I remember telling the guys, hey, look, we were into different types of music and stuff like that, but for some reason I had this I don't know, I felt like mentally, I don't know why, but I felt like I had an affiliation with Megadeth. You know what I mean? They hadn't even been around that long. And, I remember telling the guys, they were coming through town with King Diamond. And I remember telling the guys, I'm going to go to the show and I'm going to take our demo that, ended up being released later as Inception. But I took that and I said, I'm going to meet Dave Mustaine and I'm going to tell him to check this out and see if he can help us. I mean, I actually said those words, and that sounds absolutely ridiculous. but it happened. I mean, it's like I showed up, and I couldn't get backstage. Of course, they're not going to let some metal dude backstage, right? But I happened to be walking back behind the Moore Theater, and I heard the roadies talking about where they were staying, and they were staying at I think it was a hotel called the Tropicana, and I rode down there with my buddies, and we had 2 girls with us, and literally we found the parking garage, and we walked every floor of that hotel until we found the loud room, and that the door happened to be open, man, and I was like, okay, this is the moment. And I opened the door, and the 2 girls went in first, and that caused a distraction. And I swear this happened. Dave Mustaine looked at me, and he pointed to me, and I thought, oh, fuck, this is it. He's going to throw me out. And he said, come here. And I went over and sat down by him, and literally, because he had kind of a reputation, I mean, we all know about it. But we just locked in. I don't know what it was. We locked in, and we hit it off. And it was like, next thing I know, we'd been talking for hours. The time just, went on. And I convinced him after a while to come down to the car and listen to our demo tape, because, of course, back then everything was on cassette. And he liked it. And next thing I know, Dave Mustaine is handing me his phone number, and I'm like, wow, this did not just happen.
Those were wholesome, like church-going women, right?
Of
like
course,
they were,
I thought you guys were kind of like the Queensryche sort of story. You reminded me of, because that was what kind of blew us away. Queensryche was very similar in that they never
didn't play much.
Yeah, they were the Mob before that, but without Jeff. He kind of filled in with a couple shows with them, a handful of shows, while he was sort of kind of bouncing from band to band.
Now, he was in a band called Myth, right?
Yeah.
I remember them.
Babylon.
They were awesome. I can't tell you how many times we saw them. Awesome.
Yeah, Let Me Hear the Thunder was on one of Jeff Gilbert's.
Yeah, it was on the Pacific Metal.
Yeah.
So he was in Babylon, which was more of a progressive hard rock thing. Really heavy bass player they had. But the bass player ended up going to school, and it kind of split up. And so he was he actually sang for the Mob. Even it's kind of a famous thing. I don't know if Lenny was there. A lot of locals were in 1981. But this guy, Brett Miller from Lipstick, which is a band also that was on one of Jeff Gilbert's compilations. Brett Miller put on some metal shows that were 7 or 8 bands with TKO as like the headliner, and Culprit and a bunch of different bands played these. And in the first one, the Mob guys were friends of his and went way back and stuff to school and things. And they talked him into letting him on the bill if they could get a singer, and they talked Jeff Tate into doing it. And so he was kind of a wanted man, and everybody knew he was a great singer by then, and kind of had his pick of whoever, and he liked him, but he said he just wasn't interested in doing the cover songs. And so once they wrote, so he joined Myth after that, after playing a few shows with him, handful of shows. And then as he was in Myth and playing Lake Hills in a lot of places and kind of gathering steam with that, the Mob guys were writing original songs, which ended up being the songs on the EP. And so they've often said they never played live together, which is sort of true because they weren't Queensryche when they did these cover show things. But the first actual show they actually did was after they had their independent EP and basically were going to get signed. So they had a rep coming out. So they were kind of an example that other bands looked at, like, okay, you got to get up and out of the Northwest to get attention. In their case, the Harrises, their first management, who we actually interviewed Kim Harris for the book in quite an extensive and interesting interview. They had some connections, and when they went on vacation, they took the demo tape with them that fall, and basically, like, we're going to drop it off to a few places, and Kerrang was one of the main places they wanted to get it to.
That's where I read them, in the Armed and Ready section. Paul Suter, I believe, wrote that.
Paul Suter wrote, Paul Suter was, so there was a guy... He said that Paul was in the back and there was a guy in front, and the guy in the front took the tape. He said, yeah, we'll check it out, whatever. And he said Paul came up and said, what's that? Grabbed it and never let it go. and just wrote this raving review. And he said, but they had a couple months over in Europe and stuff too, and England, or a month or something like that. And Kim said by the time they got back home, they had like 1,000 letters wanting to order this thing.
Well, dude, that's how influential those early issues of Kerrang were, because that's how I heard of the band, was through a British magazine.
Yeah.
I was like, who's Queensryche? And that album was released. This was not just an independent label. They put that on their own label, 206 Records, before EMI picked up on it. So that was a really
Kim
cool
and Diana owned Easy Street Records in Bellevue, which was kind of the mecca for the metalheads. I'm sure Lenny probably must have went there a couple times. I did as a kid, actually, too. I talked my dad to driving us over there from Seattle sometimes. And I remember buying I remember the first time I went there, I think it was 83. And I figured this out. I didn't remember at the time, but I figured it out because they had a Live Evil poster in the window from Black Sabbath, which came out that year. And they had like a signing thing for the Wild Dogs there when they had like a picture. And they had all kinds of imports. So that was a place where he started in the 70s at a different record store in the U District importing a lot of stuff. And he was one of the early people for that. And they'd get a lot of German prog, krautrock stuff or whatever. And so he was vibed into with a lot of the distributor stuff into bringing that stuff in. And, you know, so they had punk and they had all kinds of metal and stuff. And so, in fact, they had something called the Wall of Death, which was all like on the wall metal records and stuff of all kinds. And so that Kim had that experience on that end of it, and his wife Diana was married to another gentleman, and they were part of the management group that signed Stryker and managed them and a few other bands in the 70s. So she had a lot of connections in the industry. And they had a lady, Mavis Brody, that got hired as a A&R person for EMI, who used to be a radio station person up there for KSW or KZOC, one of the two. And so they called her up, and she got the main guy out to come see him. And so they kind of just knew the industry enough to sort of like, hey, we got to get this under people's radar, and go that route. And so they literally get signed on the basis of opening for Zebra in these two shows back to back, Portland and Seattle in late June of 1983. And they pretty much, everybody who was there, there's, definitely was a few friends and fans and stuff there, even that early on, said they just blew them off the stage. And so they got signed, and then all of a sudden they're touring with Twisted Sister and Dio and all kinds of people. And so a lot of people that were local just kind of like, man, these guys were just like a rocket that shot out of here. And Fifth Angel used a similar kind of mentality. Metal Church used kind of a similar mentality. And these guys talked about that. And Lenny, when we talked, you guys everybody knew that, like, you got to kind of get this to somebody in the industry outside of here, get on a tour, get a record deal, and then you can kind of.
Underground was so huge, not just Kerrang, but even tape trading. I mean, I remember the Metal Church tape before they released the debut album on their own label, Zero, which got picked up obviously by Michael Lago at Elektra. But that was kind of similar, and I think they had a song on one of the Metal Blade records, and that was a big thing. Was the Metal Blade and Shrapnel. I mean, Shrapnel obviously had the Culprit album. They had, as I mentioned, Wild Dogs. They had Fifth Angel before Fifth Angel did something with
Shrapnel.
Yeah. So Shrapnel and Wild Dogs, of course. That's why I thought Shrapnel. Did they do some with Crisis too? Shrapnel? I think they were on one of the compilations.
No, Crisis did their own record. Basically, when those guys, I didn't interview those guys, but I did talk to the guitarist Tim Casey a little bit for like a half an hour or so, and he said he was just basically like a senior in high school when they did that record. His brother was a couple years older, and parents had some money and put it into the record, and the recording associates where Wild Dogs and a few others recorded had like some connection with a pressing plant or something where they got them kind of a deal. And they got picked up by Metalworks, I think, for the reissue. I want to say was that second pressing of it that came.
You mean when Metal Massacre got picked up by Metalworks? Or Crisis?
No, the Crisis guys got the reissue on that. I think it was the same label that did.
Come out? Yeah, they did August Red Moon, who I worked with, and they did the first Metal Massacre. And I think
they screwed everybody over.
They fucked everyone. What was it? Lloyd Siegel was his name, and Regency.
Yeah, I think they never paid anybody.
They never paid anyone. One of those scam labels. There were a lot of those back then. But Matt, what's your view of the? I mean, being obviously being in New York and being a big Queensryche fan, and because there was so much pre-grunge, obviously, grunge really put Seattle on the map. But we're talking, all these bands we mentioned, of course, Metal Church. We're a huge band at their TKA. We're quite big. There was that band Rail, who you mentioned. I remember seeing them on MTV.
MTV, yeah.
Yeah, before, and they were another independent band, I think, right?
The Basement Tapes, right? The Basement Tapes competition.
They won the first. They won the first Basement Tapes in '83, and they'd already been a band for like 13 years. They started in junior high, actually, in 1970. A couple of the guys, and they were one of those bands that kind of built up through the '70s, just kind of starting to learn to write and play well, and they played a lot of dances. In the '70s, there was a lot of high school and college dances that people would play at, and it was all a big circuit. And they kind of built up to where by the mid '70s, they were basically headlining the Paramount on, whatever night with a couple other local bands and doing pretty much all covers. And that's just something unheard of later on. You'd never play, in the '80s or whatever, it was all touring bands and stuff, or you had to have a major label deal. And they just kind of kept working up till they started getting interest in a record. They actually ended up working with Mike and Roger Fisher, the Heart guitarist, who had a studio together. And they ended up recording them. They were supposed to have some deal, I think, that kind of fell through with some management, and then they ended up just putting it out themselves. And that first record did pretty well for them, and it was repressed by the Passport guys, I want to say, is the California import one. One of the
Jim. They did a lot of stuff. Jim.
Yeah.
They did like Accept, and they did a lot of German and British bands. Yeah.
And I guess their deal, Rick Knotts interviewed the guitarist from Rail, and he said that the deal with them was, and he said he's pretty sure that they sold like over 200,000 copies of that record.
Wow.
Because he ran into a guy many years later, like at NAMM, that worked for him. And they had an in-house press or presses. So they would press up however many, and they never accounted for it. So there was a whole lot of problems with
there was a lot of that shit back then.
Yeah. But he said they actually did fairly well with it. And then they won the MTV thing. And I think with Rail, they were more of a product of the '70s. I mean, I remember the first time I heard Welcome, Hello, All You People was kind of one of their sort of radio songs. And I thought it was like Van Halen meets Rush. Right. But by the time they won the MTV thing, it was late '83. They got a lot of momentum from it, but I think there was so many other heavier bands kind of coming out, and they were more of an old school hard rock thing. And so they kind of went more of like a Night Ranger sort of direction, which is what happened. I mean, that was typically the scene. Like Portland had Sequel, and a couple bands like that were sort of in that sort of Loverboy kind of, AOR. That's what, people wanted to get on the radio. So they did kind of the Journey or Loverboy thing or whatever. Or you went the other way where you embraced Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and these things and kind of went the heavier direction. And
Rail was phenomenal, man. I can't tell you how many times I saw them. I must have seen them, I don't know. I bet you 50 times. Yeah, I mean, those guys, they were the type of band that, we were listening to some of the earlier Scorps and UFO and earlier Priest and stuff like that you wouldn't even hear it on the radio, but Rail was playing it every time, and they nailed it, man. It was so phenomenal. I mean, I was always blown away. It was like when you went to see Rail, a local band playing mostly other band songs, it was like going to a friggin' concert, though. It wasn't just a show, at like, a high school or something. These guys brought it. Man. It was great.
And they still do. They're still really good. I've seen them a handful of times in recent years, and every time they can do great Rush covers. They can do, and their original stuff's really good too. And the Scorpions,
They're like Y&T yesterday and today. They've been around since the early '70s and just never broke up and never really got paid their dues.
That's actually a pretty good comparison, because they kind of come out of that same sort of school of influence as Y&T, I think. Obviously Y&T goes back to like 73, 74, so they've been around. But yeah, it was just, Fifth Angel was one of those where James Bird went to LA, he told me. We did an interview. I did an interview with him, and also one of my co-writers, Jim Sutton, did an interview with Ed Archer. And so we had a couple of the guys in the band for Fifth Angel. And James said he went down to LA and hooked up with, or, California. I'm not sure if he hooked up with Mike Varney in LA or San Francisco, to be honest. But Varney, always was looking for the Guitar Hero guys, and he was looking to the Northwest, as you said, with having Wild Dogs and Culprit and people like that on the records. And he said, if you put together a band, I'll put out your record. And so he went back with a mission in mind that, I'm going to get a singer. He said he was very influenced by the Queensryche guys and what they did, and said, we're going to put this together. And he grabbed three guys from a band called Ridge, who'd won the first Battle of the Bands in '79 over the other band Tyrant, who was the runner-up, which featured Adam Baum Brenner, Gary Thompson, and Jeff Tate on vocals. And so even though Tyrant was pretty popular with the crowds, the guys told me that, and did a lot of, they did Pat Travers, Judas Priest, Rush, a bunch of Van Halen, and then had like one or two originals. Ridge had some originals, but also did some metal stuff and some like Cheap Trick and other things that sort of were real popular with the crowd, and they ended up winning it. And those three guys were Ed, that I mentioned before, Ken Mary, and Ted Pilot. And so James grabbed those guys, and they didn't have a bass player on the record either. Interestingly enough, it's James doing the bass parts and Randy Hanson the guitars.
Wow.
And the guy they put the picture on the cover, which is kind of funny, of the original Shrapnel one, Kenny K, I think was his name, was just he was in a couple battle bands, but he was mainly Randy's guitar tech guy. And so they just plugged him into the picture as so that's kind of a funny story. But they said they had like five demo songs that they'd sent Mike, and he gave them the money to record more, and then they fleshed out the record. And, of course, they got signed, same kind of thing. In their case, they had an indie too, and it got the attention of the majors. And so we had a lot of that. There was a lot of the power. What's that?
They did an indie before they signed with Shrapnel? Or?
No, they just had a demo tape that kind of got them signed. The indie was the Shrapnel record.
Gotcha. Now, we got to talk Randy Hanson, because he was one of the first guys. I saw him in '79. I think my second or third concert.
The Rainbow Show, didn't you?
Well, I saw him at Rainbow, and he opened up after Blackmore. That was, he was still doing the Hendrix then. That was, '79 tour, Down to Earth tour. And that the day before, Blackmore didn't want Randy to open the show. He didn't want to get blown away by Randy Hanson. So he said, the day before, he goes, "You're going on after me." And the opening band, believe it or not, was John Cougar. John Cougar just started out. And this was a Rainbow on the Down to Earth tour. But I saw Randy Hanson prior at the Santa Monica Civic doing the Hendrix thing, and just blew me away. And then I saw him all the time after. Then he did the solo thing in '80, which was a great record he put out. I was on Capitol Records, and that was a fantastic band.
I love that record.
Jeff Pilson on bass, and
no, actually on that self-titled record where he tried to do his own material, it's Scott Rosberg playing bass and singing.
Okay.
And a guy Charles Tapp on drums. Pilson plays on that live one he did on Shrapnel.
That's right, the Hendrix.
And Ken Mary on drums.
Right. But he was always, and of course Hendrix was a Seattle guy, which a lot of people forget that he was original Seattle dude. Yeah.
Yeah, Jimmy left pretty early on, but because he, came back and played a lot of times, and because he's from there, Seattle definitely still claims him as their own, even though he didn't care much for him after he left. But yeah, Hanson's a real interesting story too. Is that he came out of a '50s throwback band called Kid Cadillac and the Cruisers. There was a lot of in the '70s we had Happy Days and American Graffiti, and there was the 20-year sort of thing that they say where you kind of the retro, and that generation had grown up in the '50s, so you still had a lot of love for that old rock. And so there was a few of those bands. The Sonics guys kind of split up, and a couple of those guys were in Junior Cadillac, and a lot of those bands played all the the Parkers, Aquarius, a lot of these places, and toured around a lot. And he and the other two guys from the first the first Randy Hanson, Jimi Hendrix lineup thing that he did were in that band, and they started doing the Hendrix thing, and then it ended up being really popular, and they broke off to do their own trio thing. And I always felt bad for him because a solo record is great, but people just wanted to hear him do Hendrix.
Yeah.
So
the production was a little funky. It was kind of, he makes a lot of different genres, a little bit funk, different stuff with the hard rock metal stuff.
Wasn't there a song called like Champagne and Cocaine or something like that?
I love that, dude. That song fucking rules. Well, that's one of my. I gotta look that up again. I don't know if that ever came out on CD. I think actually.
Rock Candy's done it.
Candy, Derek Oliver put it. I gotta talk to Derek. I gotta get that on CD because
I want to pick it up and see if it sounds better because that production is a little muddy.
It was a little. Was Herbie Hancock? Did he produce or somebody? No, the other guy, the bass player, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Matt, get in on this conversation.
Well, no. What I'm interested in, obviously, is we're talking about obviously the 80s, but when did and I guess I can angle it to either James or Lenny. I mean, when did you guys start realizing that metal was becoming a dirty word in the area and it was all now grunge? Like when did that start to really sort of seep into the scene where metal was really starting to kind of go to the wayside, and here came this massive grunge movement? Because this is something obviously that affected the whole metal, just the whole metal genre. Yet here it is happening in your guys' backyard, which must have made it even crazier. Obviously, talk a bit about that, about how that was once grunge came along.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of remember as it was happening a little bit, but I think more of what happened was grunge just became so much more of a focus and so much more popular that metal didn't really go away. It just kind of suddenly now that was becoming the more of the underground. Mm-hmm. And I get it, I guess, but of course I'm a metal guy, but I mean, I remember when Jeff Loomis and I were sitting in a car because Loomis from Nevermore. He was in Sanctuary for a really short time. It was only about 6 months. But he originally came out to replace my cousin. And, we were playing for, 6 months together. And we're cruising along. And I remember hearing Nirvana for the first time. And they were playing it. They were playing it a lot. But I remember they played Come As You Are and Smells Like Teen Spirit. And both of us just looked at each other and were like, yeah, there's something happening here. There's a change coming, and I mean, from there.
Were they big in Seattle before? Obviously that was the Nevermind, the Bleach record and all that. They weren't like a big thing in Seattle.
No.
You know what? No? It kind of it was underground, and I mean, I actually like both those records, but you could tell. I mean, obviously. There was a big shift when Nevermind came out. I mean, it was, almost seemed deliberate, as far as their sound and everything. But I mean, I remember hearing about Nirvana and stuff like that, but it seemed like it was just kind of a grassroots thing, It hadn't really blown up. And then right around that time, of course, Pearl Jam and Mother Love Bone and all that stuff was starting to come out, and same with Alice in Chains. But I remember when we would hang out with Alice in Chains and and we were actually a bigger band than they were. And then, like, you know, suddenly overnight they're selling millions of records. You know, so
That's how it was with that scene. Yeah, it just
there was really, so a lot of this I feel really started with the crossover stuff, and you could go way back because, you know, it was interesting. Was Portland and Seattle had bands that did that very early on. I mean, you could go back to even the late
punk
70s sort of thing, and you had, you know, Fred Cole of Dead Moon's early bands like King Bee, which was kind of a crossover type of thing as far as the garage punk and a little bit of hard rock of the 70s in there. And you know, TKO had kind of a, you know, elements, a couple of the guys, the singer, they came from like a glam review with like a drag review, like sort of like the Cockettes. They had the Z Whiz Kids up there, and these guys opened up for Alice Cooper and New York Dolls and stuff in like 72, 74 range. And they were basically kind of a performance troupe that got, you know, towards the end, a band in there to be sort of a glam band. And those guys came out of Lovin' Bowie and T-Rex and Alice Cooper and things like that. And Sinsel always had kind of a punky street voice kind of thing going on. There was sort of this crossover. Yeah. And, you know, sort of a David Johansen type of thing. And both of those guys actually, Sinsel said, were pretty influenced by Eric Burdon of the Animals. And, you know, sort of a lost thing of the deeper voice style. And you would add, after TKO, their influence was so big on a lot of Seattle guys that were coming up that were younger, like the Overlord guys or the guys from Shadow, which was Mike McCready's band from Pearl Jam, you know, out of high school with his friends, and Chris and Rick Friel and those guys. And those guys had very punky singers, like snotty kind of, you know, a lot of influence of like Angel City and early Alice Cooper and, you know, and this kind of stuff, Aerosmith and things like that. And they just kind of, but they had more metal music, hard rock metal. So but they weren't very accepted by the crowds. They sort of had some crossover. It wasn't really until they opened up Guerrilla Gardens, which was kind of now, of course, famous, that this was old theater in Seattle, that they had two different rooms. It was like an old porno theater or something. And they had two different movie rooms and close to size. And when it started out, one was supposed to be the punk bands and one was going to be the metal bands, but it always ended up commingling. And, you know, Mace and Metal Church played there, and Era Perrin and the Melvins and Green River and Shadow, and all these different bands just coalesced and started getting along a little bit. There'd be some fights and stuff people talked about, but a lot of that impetus, Soundgarden was just coming out late 84, early 85. And they started kind of doing their thing. Malfunction, which was Andrew Wood from Mother Love Bone's, you know, band before that, which was, I mean, they were almost like Kiss on acid. There was a trio, really heavy, kind of metalish, almost crossover, but yet they were really glammed with all this makeup and weird costumes and kind of crazy stuff. And you know, so there was elements of that. There was sort of the goth thing kind of happening with some of that with metal and different, you know, and it coincided with a lot of the thrash metal, hardcore punk crossover stuff. And that happened in Portland a lot too. That's when I started going.
The Poison Idea bands like that.
Yeah. I started going to club shows in the fall of 86, summer, fall of 86 kind of range. And I started seeing, like, I had some friends bands that, you know, were a year my age or a year or two older kind of thing that were starting to open up for bigger bands or whatever in town. And I started, you know, before that, I was just going to see Ozzy or Scorpions or Kiss or whatever. And that was when I started seeing, hey, stuff's happening in town. And, you know, I saw like Corrosion and Conformity with Poison Idea and, you know, DRI with Accused, and all this stuff was kind of happening. And you had the thrash stuff. And, you know, like I mentioned earlier, I saw Megadeth with Sanctuary, and I saw, you know, just all these different bands coming through. And there was, you know, Wehrmacht was another Portland band that was really cool, kind of a speed metal hardcore crossover thing. And Metal Church was like an earlier, you know, thing. Metal Church was really the one in Seattle that kind of was sort of one of the first ones, them and Mace, where they, you know, and Kurt goes back to being in a punk band in the 70s, the Lewd. and they moved to San Francisco. And then once he quit, he kind of started putting together the first incarnations of Metal Church, which didn't really stick, but they had a house or apartment that they called the Church of Metal in San Francisco.
That's right. Kurt Vandenhoef. Well, a lot of people talk to them about being a San Francisco band because they kind of formed in San Francisco.
They did in 1981.
Metal,
they were doing metal demos with the guy who went on to be the singer of Griffin. They had a couple guys, Aaron Zimpel and another guy that were later in Anvil Chorus to form that. And Kurt ended up going back home and just kind of getting a couple buddies from school and things, and just started auditioning people till he kind of found the right mix. And
Ron Quintana tried getting Lars in that band, but Lars wasn't quite.
Yeah, I guess he didn't play drums. Kurt said it's sort of a myth, and I asked Kurt.
Well, he said he played drums. He was just a very because I knew Lars in Newport Beach, and he was a very rough. I mean, he just started playing drums. And Ron's like, hey, but he was such a metalhead. He knew everyone. And he was such a metal guy. And could talk his way into anything. So, they tried like auditioning him. He's like, dude, you can't. He's like, I guess Lars never really just wasn't ready to, at that time. But he got good real quick.
I asked Kurt about that, if he thought there was any.
Did he actually audition for him? Or
no, he said
he never showed, right?
Kurt just said he'd hang out. He said Lars lived, when they first came over from Denmark, they were in San Francisco for a few months. And he said Lars had a lot of great record collection and they just kind of hung out and talked music and stuff. But he said he didn't have any drums at that point. He didn't have a kid, or he didn't know about it. Right. But yeah, they were sort of one of those bands that, a few different guys talked about sort of the sea change after Metal Church and how much heavier and aggressive and different that was. Before that, and Matt from Wild Dogs, a few people talked about kind of the parting of the sea, where before that it was all metal. And when the new album was coming out,
Metal Church was so influential. They really discovered Terry Date, right? They got Terry Date's start, and they were like one of the original kind of the they go along with the Anvil, the Riot, Exciter, the Canadian Exciter. I mean, they were like one of those original real heavy kind of not really thrash, but borderline thrash.
They had elements of speed metal, I guess you would call it at that time.
The song Metal Church, the ripping in that.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And I think that was a lot, Kurt talked about the influence of punk, but he kind of felt that sort of he got kind of bored with it, basically, was how he told it. Because Interlude was a typical sort of Ramones, Sex Pistols kind of influence band, and which was cool for what it was, but he said it just wasn't very challenging, and he wanted to do more complex stuff, and metal lent that more the playing ability. I mean, that's an old joke we used to say anyway when I was growing up. Would be like when you started to have that crossover stuff with like DRI or whoever. It's like crossovers when the punk guys start to learn to play their instruments.
Well, I'm sure that's really true.
It's true. Yeah.
There's not a lot of solos in punk. I mean, if you look at the Sex Pistols record, that's kind of a really good hard rock record. Yeah. For that
time in Orange County, I knew all these punk bands I went to school with, and they're out playing the clubs after they got together in a couple weeks. They just learned a few chords.
And basic chords. You play guitar and you play bass.
And then it all kind of started to cross over a bit when metal started getting big, and you saw the LA bands, Bad Religion, TSOL, and even band from back east, Corrosion. They were all going metal when it was crossing over to that.
TOC was pretty awesome.
But they became pretty good pretty quick. But So as far as Sanctuary, Dave, this taking over a Whirl. I mean, Whirl. When obviously after he passed and all, it was that a hard thing to do to get to Sanctuary back together again and continue on? How did that work out?
Yeah, I mean, it was it's kind of a difficult thing, of course. We had a tour planned when he passed away, and we decided to, it was about 4 months after he passed away, but we decided to continue on with that, with Joseph here. I was put in touch with Joseph by John Schaefer of Iced Earth, and we hit it off. And Joseph was, he could sing in that, he could pull off the world stuff, which isn't always that easy. The early stuff, for sure. And we hit it off. So we wanted to at least keep our commitment for that tour. And then it really, when we played, the vibe and the experience that I saw people having, I felt like a lot of people really embraced it. We got to do some things that we were having trouble doing, because Worrell was having a little bit of a hard time at the end. His health was failing a little bit, and he always went out there and did his best. That's just who he was. But it was harder, and so I think that that tour in 2018 that we did, a lot of people heard songs that we hadn't done in a long time, and it was kind of it was all in tribute to Worrell, but there was something that happened.
Nice.
In honor of Sanctuary guys here.
Yeah.
Nice.
And I just feel like it made a connection with a lot of people. I saw the looks on people's faces, when we were playing Battle Angels, and people were kind of, I think that they were more than pleasantly surprised, and it just, there was a connection, and so we felt like it was worth continuing on, and we're trying to do this with the utmost respect and everything as well, but it's always hard when it's something like this,
Sure.
and it's I get it from both sides, really. It's hard for the band and it's hard for the fans.
Well, Joseph, you seem obviously a few years younger. Were you familiar with Sanctuary growing up, or was it? Or I could be wrong. Or were you? You seem like you grew up kind of more in the '90s grunge era. Were you into the '80s band, Sanctuary and all that before?
Yeah, I was a big Queensryche fan when I was growing up.
Right on.
There's no way that I would have ended up being able to sing some of the stuff I eventually learned how to sing if I wasn't a fan of that sort of stuff. There's a big disconnect between the kind of stuff that, say, that Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, and between like the clean or falsetto stuff of the metal, right? Like, it's just different. I met Lenny on that Year the Sun Died tour. I met those guys. We were out in a show in Las Vegas when they were coming through, and I didn't know the entire catalog. I obviously knew Battle Angels and Future Tense, and I had heard the new record because my other band, we used Zeus for our record, and we picked him because I had heard the new Sanctuary record and the new Queensryche. Well, that's not the new Queensryche. The first one they did with the tour, I think, that had Bulletproof on it.
Right.
Yeah. So we're like, man, this sounds really good. So we picked Zeus just from hearing the Queensryche record. Really.
Awesome. Yeah. And what's going on with? I know you guys were supposed to have a new album coming out, right? It's 2020. Is that just put off because of the pandemic, or are you guys still working on that? It was a Transmutation, I think it's supposed to be called.
Yeah, well, that's the working title, and we're working on it. It's
we have a whiteboard over there.
Okay.
You can't see it there.
You can't
Very
see it.
cool.
But,
Nice.
yeah, so we're taking our time. We're trying to make sure that it's all there, it's all dialed in, and people always hold you down to schedules, and we always tell it's going to be here, it's going to be this date or whatever, but we're hoping for 2021. I think, of course, it's not going to be in 2020 because
Sure.
But I think that there's a really good chance that we will record it in 2021, and depending upon scheduling and everything, hopefully it'll be out in 2021. If not, it would be early 2022.
Right, probably because of that. I think we'll be recording in the summer before we head out on the road.
Yeah.
And then, let the label do their thing.
We have, as of now, we have a tour planned in September of 2021. I mean, as long as everything goes okay with the whole COVID thing, we're planning. We have a tour for Europe, and hopefully a few other things as well. But before September, I'm not sure if we don't know what's going to happen. We were planning some stuff for the U.S. In April, but nobody knows, and unfortunately.
Sure.
It's been rough. I mean, like, it's a new writing relationship, like Lenny and Whirl had written for decades, they familiar with each other. So we're trying to establish that. And then it was like, oh, you want to go out and do Refuge Denied. So they're like, we tried to do a thing where we booked some place to hang out in Germany and write. And it's just, you get so busy on the road, it just doesn't work out.
Sure.
It's not like we're Metallica and we have people catering for us and we can just lounge around writing.
Sure.
But we've been consistently making slow and steady progress, and we're not trying to
look forward to it. I mean, Sanctuary. I love Nevermore too. Were you ever in Nevermore, Lenny? Did you do anything with Nevermore or no?
No,
I thought you helped them produce that.
Well, you know what I did later on after the band broke up and Nevermore was still continuing on. They came down and I recorded a demo in the studio that I had. So I was doing a lot of Seattle bands. A lot of just demo stuff, really. I did a band Choke and a couple other bands and Nevermore came in and we did like 4 songs.
Cool. Well, Matt, you think we should wind it down here? We're about a little over an hour
15.
in.
Sure, we can see if you want.
One artist I want to talk about. It's funny because a lot of because again, Seattle was growing up and collecting demos and like I said, reading about in Kerrang and all these different magazines and Shrapnel and Metal Blade and all the stuff that was releasing stuff. There was a big buzz on a lot of these Seattle bands. Way prior to the grunge movement. It was like, you had LA, you had New York, you had, San Francisco Bay Area, and we're talking pre-thrash, and then you had Seattle, which was really, but one artist I got to talk about is Adam Baum, who got a huge, I remember Geffen signed him. I actually saw him open for Metallica and Armored Saint at the Hollywood Palladium on the Ride the Lightning tour. They were throwing him on these bills. But I remember he got like a real big deal, and it was like a big buzz, and it was what's the story with Adam?
I don't know if he told.
He was around for a while, right? Since the 70s.
Yeah. Adam Baum is Adam
Brenner, right?
Adam Brenner, yeah. Yeah, I interviewed him for the book. I think he was still in New York for quite a while, and I think he moved. I can't remember what the deal was there, but he came back and played. 2015 maybe was when I saw him and interviewed him, something like that. And he and Scott Earl from Culprit was in his band, and then a younger guy on drums, and they did a lot of the Adam Baum catalog and some covers and things. And then they did Gary Thompson got up and played a couple songs with him on drums, and they did a couple TKO songs and Rock Bottom from UFO, and they had John Duvall came up and played a couple songs with him from Culprit. And so that was a lot of fun. And I talked to him for, I don't know, about half an hour, 45 minutes. We didn't really get into the Adam Baum stuff because he formed that after he left down in like LA. And then went to New York and became kind of a New York thing. But
Sandy Slavin from Riot played.
Yeah. So he kind of went through a couple different incarnations. They recorded that first. He got signed to Geffen for, I don't know what the deal was as far as, how big of a deal, but had some funny stuff around that. He's actually got a book. He kind of screwed himself on that one, and he admitted to that fully, but wrecked his, he had Lieber Krebs as management, Aerosmith's managers and Nugent. And he wrecked one of the guys' sports car, and then slept with, let's just say, a famous band person's wife or girlfriend or something. and so he got dropped. So they never really pushed that record. They kind of had a little promotional buzz around it, and then I think they dropped him. And so kind of got in some trouble around that one. But that's a really good record, actually. So
I got to ask you a question about it, because when I was a kid and, we were learning, coming up as guitar players and everything, he was kind of a legend here. And the story was that he set up his amps at the Edgewater next to Eddie Van Halen's room when they came down, and he played like Eruption or something like that, and then he ended up meeting Eddie. Is that a true story?
Yeah, he followed him around. So he was a huge fan of Van Halen from like day one. He got to go see him on the Sabbath tour when they opened, as a few people in different bands I talked to had first seen him. And he, in 79, I think he said, when it was for the Van Halen 2 tour, he got into so there was a couple girls that one of them ended up marrying John Bauer, I think, later on or something like that, he said. But a couple hot ladies that basically got him connected up into, they were working for Albatross or John Bauer, something like that, Double Teague. And so they were helping with the tour sort of stuff in locally, and they knew where they were. And so he got into the hotel where they were staying at. And I think you're right. I think it was the Edgewater, if I remember right. And he got to hang out with him quite a bit. He said Ed kind of showed him a few different licks and tricks and things, and he just kind of worshipped him. And he was like 14 years old or something at the time. He's just a prodigy. It just his family owned Renner Brothers bakeries, which were all around at the time and were kind of famous, and so they had a little bit of money, and he kind of got some guitars when he wanted and this sort of thing. He admitted to kind of being a little bit of a spoiled brat, and he was pretty fun to talk to. And he still does a lot of that stuff. I mean, he still has a lot of that sort of. He's almost like Johnny Thunders playing Van Halen or something. It's just. He's definitely got an interesting stage presence and sort of persona.
Yeah, I saw TKO many times, and he always blew me away, man. He was a very odd, interesting guy, but there was something really cool about him and the way he played.
Yeah, he's definitely kind of a rock star. So he was an interesting guy to talk to. Of course, I just focused more on Tyrant and TKO with him as he left and kind of has done other stuff. And but yeah, definitely an interesting guy. And he's got a little bio he wrote himself that's out there, I guess, which is pretty interesting. I read some of it. James Tolan had a copy of it. But yeah, so one thing I was going to tell you guys on here, you got the first exclusive because I've not said this to anybody. In fact, I just did an interview with Kevin from KISW, and I kind of teased him a little bit. But Bob already knows about this next book we're working on, as he's kind enough to let us use some quotes from some interviews he did with the guys. But as of throughout this COVID thing with all the shutdown and quarantine stuff, I managed to get 80,000 words done on a bio on Queensryche.
Nice.
Surprisingly, they have no book out on them. So, why not? That's what we did with Rusted Metal, so why not this? And we had a lot of different people. We interviewed a lot of people that we knew that were willing to let us use quotes from the interviews and things over the years. And so we got a lot of great material in there. And at this point, we're looking to have this out next year, which will kind of coincide with their 40th anniversary of the first time Jeff sang with them as the Mob. So, cool. So that's your first exclusive. Is we got a bio on Queensryche, and we're still sort of up in the air about the title, so I won't say that just yet. But that should be pretty interesting. I got 24 chapters done on it basically already.
Wow.
So,
wow,
in rough form. So,
I got a quick, like a 1 minute story. It's real. When Sanctuary first started, and Jeff was in Myth, we had one of those ads in the Rocket, and we were looking for a singer. And I knew who Jeff Tate was because I saw him Myth many times. And this was in the very early stages of Sanctuary. It was just me and my cousin, and we had an ad out, and I came home one night after a rehearsal, and there was a note on the board that said, Jeff Tate called. I never called.
Wow.
Never called him.
Never called him, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I love the guy, but I mean, we were just, we were still a baby band. It wouldn't have worked out. But.
Right.
Wow.
Well, cool. But before you throw up throw up some contact info, I got to ask about the mentors. We can't end this without the mentors. El Duce was originally a Seattle guy. Right?
Yeah, I did put a bio in there for the mentors because they actually went to Roosevelt High School. All three of the original Steve and Eldon Hogue.
They were all okay.
Yeah, all three of the original three guys went to Roosevelt High, where Duff McKagan went from Guns N' Roses, where the Shadow guys, four of the Shadow guys went. A lot of punk guys went there. And yeah, they started out, Eldon started out backing up a band called the Tupperwares in the early punk scene, which became the Screamers later on in San Francisco. It was a fairly iconic or legendary punk band now as far as that goes. But yeah, they were kind of vilified, I think. I actually saw those guys in Portland at the Satyricon one time with St. Vitus and a couple other bands. It was an amazing show. But they were always fun. I think they were metal enough to kind of include them in the book, as they were always offensive enough to be in the punk scene and maybe more accepted there, but they always, to me, felt a little more like kind of rudimentary metal stuff as far as their music. But yeah, I did, and they always came back through the Northwest and played like every year. They'd play shows and stuff.
They were the unpolished guar. That's what they were.
they kind of were sort of that before then. But,
yeah, they were one of the originators, man. I think.
I feel like you couldn't even do that nowadays. I don't know. I mean,
dude, no way.
They're still toiling around. Steve, Roy, and I think that the original drummer is still, or not original drummer, the original guitarist and original bassist are still.
They're still doing it.
Yeah, or back doing it at least. So
yeah.
Oh, Jesus.
All right, well, Matt, anything else before we end this thing?
I just want to say, there's so many, great interviews too you had in there, James. Obviously, the one with Lenny was great too. His story about in Ireland and the spitball. That's freaking pretty hilarious. And of course, and like you alluded to before, James, definitely the Kim Harris one I thought was a really awesome interview, and just to see how Queensryche really how the beginnings, of them and how they really started taking off, and like you said, the plan they had for them and everything, it was just that was a phenomenal interview. So
I think it really was one of those things, and it Kim said that definitely it was really fun sitting and talking with him, and he was really honest and forthright, and it was really interesting to see how much they sort of like, okay, if we're going to do this, we're going to have a plan, we're going to build this, and things that he said, like Jeff was very serious about it to start with, that he was a couple years older than the guys, 3-4 years older kind of thing, and so I think he'd been through more bands and kind of had more experience. So it was like, okay, we're going to do this. How much is it going to pay? This sort of thing. And it's just more serious about it. But it's really kind of interesting to see how that whole situation evolved. And there was so, it's the interesting thing is there was a lot of bands that did get some sort of record deal that, whether an indie label or major label that still are remembered, Panic had a couple great records on Metal Blade, and especially that first one is really awesome. And Forced Entry guys,
Forced Entry,
records on Combat and got around quite a bit.
They're a great band,
Yeah, we did a reissue of Heir Apparent, which was sort of the heir to Queensryche, the next heir, you might say.
They had a German guy in the band, right? A German drummer, or was it?
No. They had
from Germany that was in that.
Yeah, they had Klaus was the.
Klaus,
I think,
he was a good friend.
They kind of pulled a mutiny. You'll see if you read the interview with Terry Gorl that I did. It was kind of he was the founder and kind of main songwriter, guitarist. Right. The other guys sort of did a little bit of a mutiny on him and tried to replace him, and it didn't work out so well, which is unfortunate because they got signed to Metal Blade, who had a co-deal with Capitol, and so they had major label distribution, and the whole thing just kind of fell apart. And that sort of situation, you take a core key member out of something, everything sometimes not so easy to replace people. So
I mean, we all heard about that whole kind of lawsuit thing or with that. You know what I mean? That's kind of it's well known.
Yeah, we're actually doing a reissue of their second record too. We really like working with Terry and those guys, and the first one did really well. In fact, we basically just have like 2 or 3 copies of that left, and it's sold out. So it's like our first complete vinyl sellout of 500 copies, and the second one is going to be kind of the way that it was originally supposed to be before that whole coup kind of happened, and which was going to be a much heavier record than what came out, and so that should be pretty interesting for people. It'd be kind of an anniversary sort of edition. So,
well, I think that's great what you're doing with
your. Thank you for sending me all these records. I gotta promote. So this was the great compilation record with a lot of the. I don't know if you can see these all on the camera.
You're kind of doing like a lot of stuff. I think James is crazy. It reminds me like what Dave Baum Records is doing too, putting out a lot of these. Right?
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I really like what you're doing, with the label.
The book actually started first, and Bob's holding up some of our releases for Northwest Metalworks. Brian and I started the book, and we had a couple of the guys, Roger from Cruella, Roger DiCarlo is a friend, and I went back to seeing those guys as a teenager, and he was one of the first couple people I interviewed, as well as Mark from Whiskey Stick, which was an Astoria band that was from the 70s. And they were a very Deep Purple influenced band. It's kind of sort of like Deep Purple meets Boston type of sound with his vocals, but very Hammond driven guitar, heavy trade-off stuff. And they had a couple comp tracks, and they had one on a local compilation for KGUN, and then they had a track on that first US metal compilation from Shrapnel. And they had interest from a couple major labels, and they had management from Butch Stone, the Crocus and Black Oak, Arkansas manager, and they just didn't, they failed the auditions, and Butch was still willing to manage them, but they just ended up kind of falling apart. And they had a home studio and recorded a whole bunch of really great, like I said, very heavy Deep Purple influence. There's little elements that kind of remind me of Rainbow here and there a little bit, or Uriah Heep, that sort of thing. And that was one of the guys that said they were just kind of looking for somebody interested in putting this stuff out. Roger was interested in reissuing. He had a couple records on a German label. Shark Records was kind of the main thing for the guy that did Wehrmacht and a bunch of other. They had like Doro Pesh had a record, and Sepultura and stuff they distributed over there or whatever. But yeah, so we just kind of was like, we always kind of thought about doing something like this, and we love vinyl and always have, and collectors for a long time and stuff. And so the record label actually started before the book ever came out. We launched the first record, the Heir Apparent one, in early 2016, and we've done 7 releases. We've got a couple more, as I mentioned, Slaughterhouse 5 and Heir Apparent. We've got a couple records coming out from those guys this next year, and it's just kind of funny how it happened. The whole time I was working on this book, we were doing these records, and we brought back the Metal Fest with, Brett Miller gave us permission to kind of use the name and his blessing. And we had like TKO and Q5 and Coven and Cruella and Glacier and, all these different bands on there. And it was really great. We did a couple of those, and we have intention to do another.
These bands are still together performing, huh?
A lot of them were back together. Some did reunions around the record releases or the shows kind of thing. The Cruella guys reformed with 3 of the original guys and played a handful of shows. They even opened up for like Y&T and Grim Reaper and stuff. And Q5's been kind of gunning for a while, and a few years now they got back together. They had a brand new record a few years back, and so a lot of TKO did some reunion stuff around us putting out this round 2 thing, and they played our thing, and we had a lot of great bands. We had a couple of the Overlord guys got up together and did stuff with the Palooka guys, and we had Wild Dogs. Matt put together a lineup he'd taken out to Germany with 2 other guys from a couple Portland metal bands, and
that was
they
a great
tore
band.
it up.
You remember? I remember they had a big buzz with Dr. Mastermind, which was kind of a side project, which had Kurt James, who replaced Yngwie in Steeler. Fantastic guitar player. And of course, Dean Castronova on drums. And it was like a kind of like a super group. Never really did anything.
He was like a teenager too, right? When he
was,
it's
like Wild Dogs with Malmsteen in the band.
Yeah. It was crazy. Yeah. Was that on Shrapnel? Or was that?
Yeah, that was on Shrapnel. Yeah.
Well, why don't you throw up some contact info before we head out, where people could get buy the book, buy your albums, the vinyl, and everything else.
So the book is Rusted Metal, as Bob showed earlier. It's northwestmetalworksmusic.com is the website. We've got copies up there, and plenty of copies. The book's still available. We're keeping that around for a while, and then more records to come. And I just want to give a shout out. Joseph was phenomenal with Sanctuary. When I saw him, they did the Refuge tonight as I showed the shirt, and we saw him up in Seattle, and they were awesome. And I saw him 3 times before that with Worrell, and you did great justice to him and his legacy, and I'm really excited about seeing what you guys do with the new record. So,
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, we're definitely looking
Why
forward
don't
to
you throw out your contact there, Lenny, as far as Sanctuary, Lenny and Joseph, where people could reach the band.
Where do they go to find us?
Oh, it's sanctuaryofficial.com.
Sanctuaryofficial.com. And again, great book. Dave Reynolds does a good forward there from Metal Forces, an old pen pal. Actually, Steve Hammonds was more of a pen pal, but I knew all those, Bernard Doe, all those guys from the early days. And I know they were big fans of that scene. But great book once again. Rusted Metal. It's like a goddamn phone book.
It's
a big fucking book.
It'll take you hours to read, but great stuff. It brings you back to those early days of just the whole U.S. metal scene in Seattle. Again, was such a big part of it pre-grunge. So once again, want to thank all you guys for coming on, and definitely promote these guys. Buy the book. Definitely check out Sanctuary. Once you go out, you'll hopefully be out in Europe by next summer and do some shows here in the States once things get back to normal, hopefully soon. And thanks again, guys, for joining us. Matt,
thanks, guys. It's great talking to you. And definitely looking forward to hearing some new Sanctuary. And then James, this is fantastic. I got a lot of work to do with this still. A lot of work.
I'm looking forward to that Queensryche book, James.
That's right.
Definitely.
I forgot to mention, as kind as Dave Reynolds has been with doing the liner notes for the Overlord release we did, and for doing the introduction for this book, we're very fortunate to have Paul Suter is doing the foreword for the Queensryche book as well.
Nice. There you go. Well, say hi to Mr. Suterman for me.
He's actually down there in L.A.
Again? Because I heard he moved to Canada. He was in Canada.
No, he's back down in L.A. That's how I found him.
We hung out in the early 90s, or late 80s, early 90s in L.A. quite a bit. He was doing some publicity.
He's a really nice guy.
Yeah. What's that?
Did you talk to James Barton, the producer?
No.
We're still hoping to be able to talk to Jimbo and a couple of the other guys. We did have an interview with Neil Kern. My 2 co-writers are Brian Nairn and Brian Heaton, who runs the Anybody Listening Queensryche fan site, and he had a message board. He interviewed a bunch of the guys, and Neil and Pamela Moore and all kinds of people, and Brian's been every step of the way with Brian Nairn and I in this book, and he had a great interview with Neil Kernan talking about Rage for Order and some interesting stuff around that. So definitely, but we're hoping to talk to a couple of the other. I had, what's that?
Did you get Jimbo?
Not yet. We're still hoping to. I got a couple contact things.
I know where he lives. I did a record at his house, like.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I could set that up. He had some really funny stories about Jeff. So, Let me see if I can wrangle up contact.
Oh, yeah, for sure. If you want to recommend or whatever, we wouldn't turn you down. So Tom Hall, we talked to actually for Rusted Metal, and we had a lot of stuff with him as well. And we definitely, same kind of thing. I wanted to talk to people that were, involved in the band to whatever degree, management, producers, engineers, all that kind of thing, crew people. And
did you talk to
just
Cliff Bernstein? Cliff Bernstein?
No, but we're going to try. He might be tougher to get through to.
All right, guys. Once again, man, it was a pleasure. Definitely support these guys. Buy the book, and good luck with that. Keep us posted on definitely on the Queensryche book.
Sure.
And Sanctuary, guys, definitely keep us posted when you guys are out touring again, and we'd love to have you guys back on. Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Yeah. All right, guys.
All right, thanks a lot, guys.
All right.
Take it easy, guys.
Thanks a lot.